The small town hall was glowing with soft golden lights that evening. Chairs had been arranged neatly in rows, and the faint smell of polished wood and coffee floated in the air. People were excited, dressed in their best, chatting about the local concert that everyone had been waiting for. A well-known pianist was visiting to perform, and many had come just to hear him play. Among the crowd walked a man quietly, almost unnoticed. He wasn't dressed fancy, just a plain shirt, a worn-out coat, and shoes that had seen better days. His face carried calmness, but his eyes held a kind of depth that only those who had lived through a lot could have. No one paid much attention as he slowly moved toward the rows near the stage. He looked around, smiled slightly, and took a seat at the edge. As the audience waited, the sound of laughter filled the room. Friends whispered. Children pointed at the grand piano in the middle of the stage, and the host made cheerful announcements. The air buzzed with excitement. Everyone was there for music, but no one could have guessed what kind of night it would turn into. When the concert began, the famous musician walked in to loud applause. He bowed, flashed a confident smile, and started his performance. His fingers moved fast, his face full of pride. The crowd admired him. They nodded, clapped, and smiled politely between pieces. Everything felt predictable. Good music, polished skills, and a little bit of showmanship. It was a fine evening so far. After an hour, the musician paused to take a break. People stood, stretched, and talked among themselves. The piano stood silently under the spotlight. That's when the quiet man in the plain coat got up. Without saying a word, he began walking toward the stage. Some noticed him, wondering what he was doing. The host saw him and gave a confused look, but before anyone could stop him, the man stepped up the small stairs and stood beside the piano. A few chuckles echoed through the hall. Some thought he was part of a planned act, maybe a joke between performances. The musician, standing near the backstage curtain, folded his arms, half amused. The man placed one hand gently on the piano lid, as if greeting an old friend. He looked at the host and said softly, "May I play something?" "Just one piece." The host blinked, unsure if he was serious. The audience murmured. "You?" someone whispered. "Is he even part of the program?" Another asked. The musician smirked slightly, shaking his head with a smile that said, "This should be interesting." The host tried to be polite. "Sir, this is a scheduled event. Maybe another time." But the man interrupted gently. "It will only take a few minutes." His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that didn't demand attention, it invited it. After a moment of hesitation, the host looked at the musician, who shrugged with a mocking grin, clearly enjoying the little disturbance. "Why not?" the musician said aloud. "Let him play. Let's see what he's got." The crowd laughed, clapping lightly as if this was part of the entertainment. The man nodded politely and sat down on the bench. The laughter grew a little louder. Someone joked, "He looks like he hasn't played before." Another said, "Maybe he'll surprise us with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." But the man didn't react. He adjusted the bench, closed his eyes for a second, and placed his hands on the keys. The hall grew quieter, but not out of respect, out of curiosity. Everyone waited for something funny or awkward to happen. The first few notes came out soft and hesitant, like someone trying to remember a long-forgotten tune. A few people giggled. Even the musician at the back smirked, shaking his head. But then something changed. His hands began to move differently, more sure, more graceful. The rhythm started to build, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat finding its pace. A hush began to settle in the room. The uncertain laughter faded. The man's fingers flowed across the keys, each note blending into the next as if they were connected by invisible threads of emotion. The music didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like a confession. It carried warmth, longing, and something painfully human, something only life could teach. The audience leaned forward, almost holding their breath. The melody grew stronger, deeper. The man wasn't showing off. He was simply feeling every note, letting the piano speak for him. His eyes stayed closed, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Every rise and fall in the music felt like a story, a memory wrapped inside sound. The high notes shimmered like sunlight through old windows, and the low ones echoed like footsteps in an empty hallway. The crowd that once mocked him now sat frozen in awe. Even the professional musician, who had been standing in the shadows, slowly stepped closer to the stage. His face had lost its earlier smirk. There was confusion now, maybe even disbelief. He recognized what he was hearing. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. Every chord carried precision and passion that only years of love and pain could create. The man's shoulders moved slightly as the tempo quickened. It wasn't loud or dramatic, yet it was powerful. You could almost feel his life inside the melody. The struggles, the nights he might have spent dreaming beside a broken piano. The times when music was the only friend who listened. There was something heartbreakingly honest about the way he played. Minutes passed, though no one could tell how long. Time seemed to stand still. The audience, who had come for a show, found themselves pulled into something much more personal. The laughter was gone, replaced by silence and wonder. Some people's eyes glistened. Others sat with their mouths slightly open, afraid to blink. The man's fingers slowed again, the notes softening into a whisper. It felt as if he was saying goodbye, to the song, to the piano, maybe to a part of himself. The final chord lingered in the air, trembling like the last breath of a long story. And then there was silence. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The room was completely still. The only sound was the faint creak of the piano bench as he lifted his hands and rested them on his lap. He didn't look at the crowd. He simply sat there, breathing softly, eyes still closed. Then, as if waking from a spell, the audience erupted. The silence broke into a storm of applause, loud, genuine, overflowing. People stood up, clapping and shouting. Some were crying without knowing why. The sound filled every corner of the hall. It wasn't the polite applause given to the earlier performer. It was the kind that comes from deep respect. The man opened his eyes slowly and looked around, surprised but calm. A faint smile appeared on his lips. He nodded once, then stood up quietly. The professional musician was among the first to walk toward him. His confident expression had melted away completely. He extended his hand, his voice low. "That was incredible," he said, almost in disbelief. The man shook his hand gently, giving a humble smile. "Thank you," he said softly. There was no pride in his tone, no sense of revenge or triumph. It was as if the music itself had spoken everything he wanted to say. The audience kept clapping, cheering, calling for one more song. But he didn't sit down again. He stepped off the stage quietly, moving past the rows of chairs as people reached out to touch his shoulder or shake his hand. Some whispered words of praise. Others just smiled, still moved by what they had witnessed. He reached the exit door and paused for a second. The applause still echoed behind him. He turned slightly, looked back at the piano under the spotlight, and for a brief moment his eyes softened with something between love and nostalgia. Then he walked out, disappearing into the cool evening air. Outside, the night was calm. The streetlights glowed softly, and a gentle wind carried the faint sound of the crowd still inside the hall. The man walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, a quiet smile on his face. He didn't care about what people thought of him before, or what they would say now. All that mattered was that he had played, truly played, for the first time in years. Back inside, the professional musician sat on the piano bench again, staring at the keys as if seeing them for the first time. He tried to play something, but his hands trembled slightly. The notes didn't sound the same anymore. It wasn't about technique or fame anymore. It was about soul, and he had just been reminded of what real music meant. The people in the hall talked about the performance long after it ended. Some said the man was a forgotten genius. Others said he must have been a teacher or a retired artist. No one really knew his story, but everyone felt something they couldn't explain. It wasn't just admiration, it was connection. That night, they learned something beautiful and simple. Talent doesn't always wear fancy clothes or walk under bright lights. Sometimes it sits quietly among the crowd, waiting for a moment to speak. And when it does, it doesn't just play music, it touches hearts, silences pride, and reminds everyone why art matters. The man never came back to that hall again. No one even knew his full name. But for years after that night, people kept talking about him. The stranger who walked in quietly, sat down at the piano, and turned laughter into tears. The hall became famous for that story. Visitors would look at the old piano and ask, "Is this where it happened?" The staff would nod and smile, saying yes, that was the piano. Some nights, when the hall was empty, someone would press a few keys just to hear their echo, and for a moment it felt like he was still there, letting the music speak once more. What started as laughter became a memory no one forgot. That simple evening turned into a lesson about humility, patience, and the quiet strength of believing in yourself even when others don't. It wasn't just about a song, it was about a soul that refused to fade. And somewhere out there, far from the lights and applause, the man probably sat by another old piano, smiling softly, still playing for himself and maybe for the ones who had finally learned to listen. The next morning, the small town was still buzzing with talk about the night before. The story had spread faster than anyone expected. People in the bakery were whispering about the mystery pianist. The cafe on the corner was full of customers replaying every moment from the concert. Everyone had an opinion. Some swore the man must have been a retired musician. Others said he was a self-taught genius who'd been living quietly among them for years. But no one really knew who he was. The hall manager tried to find his name on the guest list, but there was nothing. The only clue was that he had bought a ticket at the door, paid in cash, and written just one word on the registration slip. Daniel. And that was it. No last name, no address, nothing else. The professional musician who had hosted the concert couldn't stop thinking about him either. That night had changed something inside him. He sat in his hotel room with the television on mute, staring at his hands. He replayed the sound of the man's piano in his mind, the softness, the honesty of every note. It wasn't just skill. It was something deeper, something that came from the heart. He had spent years chasing perfection, fame, and applause, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the plain coat had shown him what real music meant. Not performance, not glory, just truth. Meanwhile, Daniel was miles away, sitting by a small window in his modest home. The piano he had played the night before wasn't his. It belonged to the concert hall. But at home, he had an old upright piano, faded and cracked, its sound slightly uneven. He touched the keys gently, almost afraid to disturb the silence of the morning. He wasn't thinking about the applause or the crowd's reaction. He was thinking about how it felt to play again, to truly lose himself in the sound. It had been years since he had done that. Music had once been his world, his dream, his everything, but life had pulled him away, quietly and firmly as it often does. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat near the piano, lost in thought. The sunlight touched his hands, making the veins on his skin look like the lines of an old map. Those hands had once been young, full of strength and hope. He smiled faintly at the memory of his younger self, when he believed that talent and passion alone could change everything. But dreams don't always grow the way we expect. Sometimes they bend, fade, or get buried under responsibility. Years ago, Daniel had been full of promise. He had studied at a small music academy, working nights to pay for tuition. Teachers had admired his dedication. He feels music, they used to say. He doesn't just play it. But when his father fell ill, he left school to take care of him. Then came bills, debts, and the quiet weight of real life. The piano slowly became a thing of the past, something he played when time allowed, which wasn't often. He worked simple jobs, anything that paid the rent and kept food on the table. Music became something he carried inside, not something the world saw. Yet even when years passed, he never lost the rhythm in his fingers. Late at night, after long days of work, he would visit an old cafe near his house where an unused piano sat in the corner. The owner let him play after closing time. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes just for a few minutes. Those nights were his secret world, where the noise of life faded and only the sound of the keys remained. Last night at the hall, when he saw that grand piano under the spotlight, something inside him stirred. He hadn't planned to play. He had come just to listen, to feel the music again from the audience's seat. But when he saw the performer's confident smile, the rehearsed showmanship, and the crowd's shallow applause, something inside him whispered play, not to prove anything, but to remember who he really was, and he did. Now, sitting in his quiet house, he didn't feel proud. He didn't feel famous. He just felt peaceful, as if a long-lost part of himself had come back home. But the world wasn't ready to let him disappear so easily. By afternoon, a journalist from the local newspaper had arrived at the hall asking about him. The story of the mystery pianist was all over town. People wanted to know who he was, where he came from, and how he had played with such beauty. The hall manager shrugged. He just showed up, he said, sat down and changed the whole room. A few people started searching for him. Someone thought they recognized his face from the hardware store. Another claimed he lived near the edge of town. The musician himself asked around quietly, wanting to thank him properly, maybe even invite him to perform together. But Daniel wasn't looking for attention. He preferred silence to praise. That evening, he went for a walk near the river. The water shimmered under the orange sky. Children played on the banks, throwing stones into the water, laughing freely. He watched them for a while, remembering his own childhood, the days when he would sit by an old upright piano, his mother humming beside him as he tried to match her tune. She used to tell him, "Play with your heart, not your hands." He smiled softly, whispering those words again. As he stood there, a young boy approached him. He looked around 12, carrying a small backpack and holding a folded newspaper. "Sir," the boy said shyly, "are you the man who played at the concert last night?" Daniel blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" The boy grinned, holding up the newspaper. On the front page was a blurry photo of him at the piano taken from the back. The headline read, "Unknown man stuns audience with unexpected piano masterpiece." Daniel laughed gently, shaking his head. "Seems they caught me after all." "My mom was there," the boy said eagerly. "She said everyone cried when you played." "I wish I could have heard it." Daniel looked at him kindly. "Do you like music?" "I love it," the boy said quickly. "But we don't have a piano at home. I just watch videos and pretend to play." Daniel smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep pretending," he said softly. "That's where it starts. Someday you'll have one. And when you do, play for yourself, not for others. The music will find you when it's ready." The boy nodded seriously as if he had just received a secret message. He thanked Daniel and ran off, still holding the paper tightly. Daniel watched him go, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. Maybe that was what all of this was for. Not fame, not recognition, but to pass on something that mattered. Over the next few days, more people came looking for him. Some left notes on his door. Others sent letters to the local radio asking if he could perform again. But Daniel stayed quiet. He wasn't avoiding them out of pride. He just felt that the magic of that one night couldn't be repeated. It had been pure, honest, a moment that lived only because it wasn't planned. One evening, a car stopped in front of his house. When he opened the door, the professional musician stood there holding a small envelope. "I've been trying to find you," the musician said, smiling humbly. "I wanted to thank you in person. What you did that night." He paused, searching for the right words. "It reminded me why I started playing in the first place." Daniel nodded, his face calm. "Music has a way of reminding us of who we are." The musician handed him the envelope. "We're having another concert next month. I want you to be part of it. Officially this time. The audience would love to hear you again." Daniel looked down at the invitation, reading it slowly. The hall's name was printed in gold letters, the program neatly listed. He thought about it for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Thank you," he said, "but I think I'll pass. That night was enough. I didn't play for the stage. I played because I missed it." The musician hesitated, then nodded respectfully. "I understand," he said softly. "But if you ever change your mind, the door is always open." After he left, Daniel stood by the window watching the car disappear into the dark street. He felt no regret, only gratitude. Life had given him one more chance to play from his heart, and that was enough. Weeks passed. The story of the mystery pianist became a local legend. People talked about it for months, and then slowly, like all things, it became just another beautiful memory. But for Daniel, it remained a quiet turning point. He began to play more often at home, sometimes leaving the window open so that the neighbors could hear. Children would stop outside to listen, smiling as the notes drifted into the evening air. One night, as he played softly, he heard a knock at his door. It was the same boy from the river holding a small keyboard. "My mom got me this," he said excitedly. "I wanted to show you. I've been practicing." Daniel's heart warmed. He invited the boy in, showed him how to place his fingers properly, how to feel the rhythm instead of counting it. They played together until it grew dark. Before leaving, the boy asked, "Will you teach me again?" Daniel smiled, his eyes gentle. "Of course. Music is meant to be shared," and so it began. What started as a single moment of courage in a crowded hall turned into something far more meaningful. Every week the boy came by and soon others joined, neighbors, children, even adults who had once given up on their dreams. Daniel didn't call himself a teacher. He just opened his door and let the music flow. He never charged a fee. His reward was the laughter that filled his small home, the sound of new melodies being born. The piano that once stood silent now sang every evening, its notes weaving through the neighborhood like warm light. People still remembered that night in the hall, but Daniel no longer needed the memory. He had found something better, the joy of giving music back to the world one heart at a time. Outside, life went on. The seasons changed, the town grew, and the hall hosted many more concerts. But somewhere, in a small room with a cracked old piano, a man kept playing, not for applause, not for fame, but for the love of music itself. And this time, the laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was pure happiness, the kind that fills the air when people discover something true. The sound of soft piano notes floated through the evening air, slipping out from the small windows of Daniel's house and spreading down the quiet street. The neighbors had gotten used to it by now. Every evening, just after sunset, the music would begin, gentle at first, like a whisper, and then slowly building into something full and beautiful. People would pause while walking past, listening for a while before moving on. Inside, Daniel sat at the old upright piano, his fingers dancing lightly over the keys. The small room was warm and filled with laughter. Around him sat 3 children and 2 adults, all watching eagerly, waiting for their turn to play. One of them was the same boy from the river, the one with the small keyboard. He had improved so much that Daniel often let him lead the group. "Remember," Daniel said softly, "you don't play music just to make it sound good. You play to feel something. If your heart isn't in it, the piano knows." The boy nodded seriously and started playing a simple tune. His fingers trembled at first, but Daniel smiled and nodded encouragingly. The other children clapped softly when he finished, and the boy's face lit up with pride. Every week, the small group grew. What started as one boy learning after school became a little community of learners. Some were children, others were adults who had always wanted to play but never had the chance. Daniel didn't turn anyone away. He never charged a fee. The only rule was that they had to play with sincerity. Music had brought life back into his home. The once quiet house now echoed with laughter, the sound of wrong notes, and the joy of trying again. Some evenings, when the group was gone, Daniel would sit alone and think about how everything had changed since that night at the concert hall. He had never imagined that a single performance could touch so many lives. But it wasn't about fame, it was about connection. Music, he realized, had its own way of spreading. One person's song could ripple out and find its way into another person's heart. One day, as Daniel finished tuning the piano, a knock came at the door. When he opened it, he saw the professional musician who had once mocked him, the same man from the concert. He looked different now, humbler, almost nervous. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Daniel nodded and led him inside. The musician looked around at the small, cozy room filled with sheet music, pencils, and little notes from students pinned to the wall. "I've been traveling," the man said, "playing concerts, teaching workshops. But everywhere I go, people still talk about that night. The night you played." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's strange how things spread, isn't it?" The musician nodded. "It changed me. I used to play for applause, for perfection. But that night you reminded me that music isn't about showing off. It's about honesty." There was a silence between them for a moment. Then the musician continued, "I'm organizing a community concert next month. It's for charity. Music education for children who can't afford it. I'd like you to come. Not to perform, but to help teach. You've started something beautiful here. You could help us do it on a bigger scale." Daniel looked thoughtful. He glanced at the piano, then at the small group of photographs on the shelf, pictures of his students smiling beside him. "I'm not sure I belong on a big stage anymore," he said gently. "You belong wherever music needs you," the musician said quietly. Daniel said nothing at first. But later that night, as he sat at the piano alone, he thought about it again. He remembered his younger days when he used to dream about sharing music with the world. Maybe this was his second chance, not for fame, but for purpose. He finally agreed to help. The following weeks were filled with preparation. Daniel and the musician worked together to organize the event. The goal was simple: bring together children from different backgrounds and let them perform, learn, and feel the joy of music. The town's hall, the same one where it all began, was chosen for the concert. Word spread quickly. People remembered the story of the unknown pianist who had once silenced a whole crowd. Now they were excited to see what he would do next. But this time Daniel didn't plan to take center stage. His students would the day of the concert arrived. The hall was filled once again, just like before. The lights were warm, and the piano stood proudly under the spotlight. Children backstage fidgeted nervously, adjusting their ties and dresses. Daniel moved among them, giving small words of comfort. "Don't worry about being perfect," he whispered. "Play with your heart. That's all that matters." When the curtain lifted, the first group walked out. 3 of his students, including the young boy who had once carried the newspaper. They sat at their pianos side by side and began to play. The music was simple, but it carried warmth. Each note sounded alive, full of innocence and hope. The audience listened quietly. Some recognized the style, the gentle, emotional flow that had marked Daniel's own playing. It was clear that he had passed on more than technique. He had passed on feeling. As the evening went on, one performance followed another. Some were flawless, some stumbled halfway, but each was genuine. Daniel watched from the side of the stage, his eyes shining with quiet pride. He didn't need to perform. Hearing them play was enough. When the concert ended, the applause was thunderous. Parents cried, children laughed, and the musician who had once mocked Daniel stood by his side, smiling deeply. "This," the musician said, "this is what music should do, bring people together." Daniel nodded. "It always could. We just forget sometimes." After the concert, people came up to thank him. Some asked for lessons, others just wanted to shake his hand. But what touched him most was when a woman approached him holding her little girl by the hand. "She watched your students play," the woman said. "Now she says she wants to learn too." Daniel knelt down to the child's level. "Then you must promise me something," he said softly. "Promise to play with kindness, not pride." The little girl nodded seriously and he smiled. That night, when everyone had gone and the hall was empty, Daniel stayed behind. The lights were dim and the stage was quiet except for the faint hum of the old piano. He sat down and touched the keys gently. It had been months since he had played for an audience, but now he felt like playing. Not for anyone else, just for himself. His fingers began to move slowly and a soft tune filled the empty hall. It was peaceful, like a memory being retold. The professional musician, who had been packing up equipment nearby, stopped and listened. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, letting the music wash over him again. It was the same feeling as before. Pure, unforced, timeless. When Daniel finished, he looked up and smiled. "Still learning," he said with a quiet laugh. The musician nodded. "And teaching," he replied. From that day on, Daniel's life took on a quiet rhythm. He continued teaching his small group, but more people started joining. Soon a community music center was opened with help from the town and the musicians' charity. It was small at first, a few pianos, a few teachers, but it grew quickly. Daniel never wanted to be the face of it. He stayed in the background, guiding, helping, smiling. For him, it wasn't about recognition. It was about giving others the chance to feel what he had once felt. That deep, wordless connection that only music could bring. Sometimes, when he walked down the street, people would stop to greet him. They called him the man who played from the heart. Children waved, adults thanked him. And though he always smiled and nodded, inside he remained humble. He knew fame was fleeting, but kindness lasted. One rainy afternoon, he sat by the window watching drops slide down the glass. His old piano stood quietly beside him. He thought about his life. The struggles, the loss, the laughter, and the strange twist of fate that had brought him back to music. He realized something beautiful then. Maybe the laughter that had once surrounded him wasn't meant to humiliate him. It was meant to test him, to see if he still believed in himself. And when he did, when he chose to play anyway, everything changed. He reached out and played a few notes, smiling softly to himself. Music had given him so much: peace, purpose, and the power to touch others without saying a single word. Outside, as the rain continued to fall, a few children ran past his house. They stopped when they heard the sound of his piano. One of them called out, "He's playing again," and they all stood under the porch, listening with wide eyes and wet hair. Daniel didn't notice them at first. He was lost in the melody, but when he finally looked up and saw them, he waved, and the children waved back, laughing. He motioned for them to come inside, and soon the small house was filled again with muddy shoes, giggles, and the sound of music. The old piano, worn and imperfect, kept singing. Its voice wasn't flawless, but it was real, just like him. And in that moment, surrounded by young faces and laughter that no longer mocked but celebrated, Daniel realized something simple yet profound. He had spent his life chasing dreams, losing them, finding them again. But through it all, the music never left him. It had been waiting quietly for him to believe again, and now, every note he played carried that truth into the world. One small, honest melody at a time. The sound of the last note still hung in the air, soft and trembling like a final whisper that didn't want to end. For a moment, the audience didn't move. It was as if everyone had forgotten to breathe. Then slowly the silence broke. Not with laughter this time, but with the sound of deep, honest applause. Some people stood clapping with trembling hands. Others just stared at him, unable to speak. The professional musician who had mocked him earlier lowered his eyes in quiet disbelief. But as he sat there at the piano, his hand still resting lightly on the keys, his mind was far away. The crowd saw a calm man, humble and quiet, but inside him, memories rushed in like waves. That one moment on stage had brought back everything, all the pain, the sacrifices, the nights he spent alone with music when the world had turned its back on him. Many years before this night, he had been a young man with dreams bigger than his life. He used to sit in front of an old, out-of-tune piano that belonged to a neighbor. The sound was never perfect, but it didn't matter. To him, even the broken keys had a story to tell. His father used to work long hours at a factory, and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. There wasn't enough money for lessons, not even for sheet music. So he taught himself. He listened to the radio, tried to copy what he heard, and played until his fingers hurt. Sometimes late at night, when everyone was asleep, he would sneak out to the neighbor's house. The old man who owned the piano used to leave the door unlocked because he knew how much that boy loved to play. He would sit there in the dim light, pressing each key softly so no one would hear. That was his world, the only place where everything made sense. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When his father got sick, he had to quit school and find work. He worked anywhere that would pay, carrying boxes, cleaning shops, even washing dishes at a small diner. Every coin he earned went to help his family. Music became a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, whenever he passed by a music store, he'd stop for a moment and just listen. The sound of the piano still called him, even when he tried to ignore it. Years passed. His hands became rough from work, and his clothes were often dusty, but his heart still carried that same rhythm, that same silent dream. Sometimes, after long days, he'd hum to himself while walking home, pretending his steps were notes. He didn't tell anyone about his love for music anymore. People would laugh and say, "You need to focus on real life. Dreams don't feed you." So he stayed quiet, keeping his dream hidden like something too fragile to expose to the world. One winter evening, while helping fix some shelves in a small community hall, he found an old piano sitting in the corner covered in dust. The hall was empty, the lights dim. He couldn't resist. He wiped the dust away and pressed a single key. The sound was weak but alive. Something inside him stirred. That night, when everyone had left, he came back alone. He played again, his fingers remembering what his mind had tried to forget. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make his heart ache. From then on, he started visiting that piano every night after work. The janitor who cleaned the hall saw him once and smiled. "You play like someone who's missed it for too long," the man said. He didn't answer, just kept playing. It became his secret ritual, his only escape from the world that didn't understand him. There were nights he'd fall asleep beside the piano, and mornings he'd wake up with his fingers still resting on the keys. Years later, when life finally gave him a little peace, he found a small job teaching children how to play simple tunes on a keyboard. He never told them his full story. To them, he was just a kind man who smiled a lot and loved music more than words. Watching those children learn reminded him of himself, full of wonder, full of hope. Then came the day of the concert. The invitation wasn't meant for him. It was for his students to attend and watch a famous musician perform. But when the children asked him to come along, he agreed. He didn't know that his quiet presence would soon become the center of attention. When he arrived at the hall that evening, he had no plan to play. He only wanted to sit in the back to listen, to feel the sound of live piano fill the room once more. But as he listened, something felt off. The famous musician's performance was perfect in technique but empty in soul. Each note was sharp, each movement precise, but the music had no warmth. It felt like someone showing skill, not someone sharing a story. Then when the host announced that anyone from the audience could come forward and play a short piece for fun, The crowd laughed. It was meant as a light moment, not serious, but he felt a strange pull in his chest. Maybe it was his years of silence. Maybe it was his heart asking for one last chance to speak. He stood up quietly and walked toward the stage. People started whispering the moment they saw him. Some laughed, others just watched, confused. The musician on stage gave him a doubtful look. His clothes were plain, his shoes worn. He didn't look like someone who belonged next to a grand piano. But he didn't care. When he sat down, the piano felt familiar, almost like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. At first, his fingers hesitated, not because of fear, but because of emotion. But then the music found him again. It flowed through him like water, like it had always been waiting for this moment. The room that once laughed at him grew silent. Every note carried a piece of his story, his childhood, his struggles, his sleepless nights, his unspoken dreams. The audience didn't know it, but they were hearing his life. Now, as he sat there with the final note fading away, he thought of all those years he had hidden his music from the world. The applause that filled the room wasn't just for the melody. It was for everything he had lived through quietly. It was as if the world was finally saying, "We hear you." The professional musician walked up to him. His face no longer had that proud smirk. Instead, it showed respect, maybe even regret. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. The man smiled faintly and said, "Life taught me." That simple answer said more than any long explanation could. After the show, people surrounded him asking questions, taking pictures, wanting to know who he was. But he didn't stay long. He thanked them politely, then slipped out quietly into the cool night air. The sky was full of stars and the city lights glowed below. For the first time in many years, he felt light, not because of fame or attention, but because he had finally let his heart speak. As he walked home, he thought about his younger self, that boy who used to sneak into a neighbor's house to play an old piano in the dark. He smiled, realizing that boy had never really gone away. He had just been waiting for the right moment to return. Later that week, a local newspaper wrote a small story about the mysterious man who silenced a concert hall with his music. They called him the unknown pianist. People started talking about him everywhere. Videos of his performance were shared online. Some said his playing reminded them of great composers. Others said they could feel something deeper, something real, in every note. But he didn't chase any of it. He didn't care for fame or interviews. He still went to his teaching job, still helped his students learn simple tunes, still smiled the same quiet smile. For him, that one night had been enough. It was proof that even when the world forgets you, your passion remembers you. In the evenings, when the day's noise faded and the sky turned golden, he would sit by the same old piano in the community hall. Sometimes he played the same piece he had played that night. Other times he just let his fingers wander, creating soft tunes no one would ever hear. To him, that was peace, knowing that music still lived in him untouched by time. The janitor would sometimes stop by and listen, leaning against the wall with a gentle smile. "You know," he said once, "you could be famous if you wanted." The man chuckled and replied, "I don't need the world to know my name. I just need to keep playing." Those words summed up his life, simple, honest, and full of quiet strength. Every note he played after that carried gratitude. Gratitude for the struggles that shaped him, for the people who doubted him, and even for the laughter that once filled the room before his music began. Because without all that, he might never have played with such truth. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he could still see the faces of the crowd, the shock, the tears, the awe. But most of all, he remembered the feeling of peace that came with that final note. That was the moment he knew he had nothing left to prove. He had done what his heart had longed to do since he was a boy. He had spoken through music, and the world had finally listened, and somewhere deep inside, he hoped that someone from that audience, maybe a young person sitting in the back row, would remember that night and be inspired to never let go of their own dream, no matter how small or far away it seemed. Because dreams, like music, don't die. They just wait for the right moment to be heard. The night after the concert, the man barely slept. He lay on his small bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the music again and again. It wasn't the applause that kept him awake. It was the silence that had followed his last note, that deep, complete silence where everyone seemed to hold their breath. That moment had felt bigger than anything he'd ever known. It was as if time had stopped just to listen. He smiled faintly, thinking about how people had laughed when he first sat down at that grand piano. It wasn't anger he felt, no, not at all. It was almost gratitude, because without that laughter, maybe he wouldn't have played with such honesty. Maybe he wouldn't have reached that place inside him where music was born not from pride, but from truth. The next morning, he went about his day as usual. He made tea, swept the small porch of his house, and walked to the community center where he taught children how to play. He didn't tell anyone about the concert. The few who already knew brought it up, of course. The janitor, a couple of parents, and even one of the older students who had seen a video online. But he only smiled and said, "It was a good night." He didn't talk about how the professional musician had walked up to him afterward, eyes filled with disbelief and respect. He didn't tell anyone about the messages he'd received later that night from people he didn't even know, people saying how his music had moved them. To him, those things weren't the reason he played. He played because it made him feel alive, because it connected him to something larger than words. But that day, something was different at the community center. As soon as he entered the hall, the children clapped and cheered. "We saw you," one of them shouted, their little faces glowing with excitement. "You were on the internet. Everyone's talking about your music." He chuckled softly and shook his head. "Everyone?" he said in a gentle voice. "That can't be true." "It is," another child said, waving a phone. "Look, you're all over the place. They called you the man who silenced the hall." He looked at the screen for a moment, his eyes soft but unreadable. He didn't know how to react to fame. It felt strange to see his name online, to see thousands of people commenting about him. But what touched him most weren't the compliments. It was the stories people shared underneath. Some wrote that they had been too afraid to chase their dreams, but after hearing him play, they wanted to try again. Others said his music made them cry because it felt like home. That evening, after the lessons ended, he stayed behind. The hall was empty again, just as it had been in the beginning. He sat down at the piano and let his fingers rest on the keys. He didn't play anything grand this time, just a soft melody that drifted like a whisper through the quiet room. As he played, he thought about how far he had come, though he never set out to be seen. He had only wanted to feel the piano once more, and somehow that simple wish had touched so many hearts. A week later, he received a letter. It was from the same musician who had once laughed at him, the one whose performance had come before his. The handwriting was neat, the words carefully chosen. The letter said, "I watched the video of your performance again and again. I must admit I misjudged you that night. Your playing reminded me of why I started making music in the first place. I had forgotten the feeling behind it, the honesty, the soul. I'd like to invite you to perform with me at my next concert. The stage will be yours as much as mine. I owe you that." He read the letter several times. The offer was kind, generous even, but it made him uneasy. He wasn't sure if he belonged on a big stage beside someone who had made music their career. He had always been a man who played quietly, not for crowds but for himself. Still, there was something in those words that touched him, the humility, the recognition of shared love for music. He didn't answer right away. He took a few days to think. During that time, life went on as usual. He taught, he played, he laughed with the children. But late at night, when he was alone, he'd sit by the piano and imagine what it might feel like to stand before another crowd. Not as a surprise guest, but as someone invited, respected. Maybe, he thought, this time he could play not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Finally, he wrote back. His message was short. "Thank you for your words. I would be honored to share the stage with you." When the day of the concert arrived, the hall was packed again. People were eager to see the man whose story had touched their hearts. Cameras lined the aisles, lights glowed, and the sound of chatter filled the room. But backstage, he felt the same calm he always did before touching the piano. To him, this was no different from those quiet nights at the community hall. The piano was still a friend, and music was still the same truth. The musician who had invited him came to greet him before the show. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came," he said sincerely. "Tonight we make music not to impress but to feel. The man nodded. That's the only way music should be made, he replied. When it was his turn to perform, the lights dimmed and the crowd grew quiet. He walked out slowly without any grand gestures or introductions. He sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time the music wasn't heavy with sadness or longing. It was lighter, filled with warmth and peace. The notes rose and fell like waves, carrying a story of forgiveness, growth, and gratitude. It was a song of healing, not just for him, but for everyone listening. People in the audience closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. Some cried quietly, others just smiled. The professional musician stood at the side of the stage, hands clasped, watching in awe. It wasn't just talent he saw, and it was truth. The kind of truth that can't be taught, only lived. When the last note faded, the audience rose to their feet once more. But this time the applause felt different. It wasn't just admiration, it was connection. They weren't clapping for a stranger anymore. They were clapping for someone who reminded them what it meant to feel alive. After the show, the musician walked up to him and said, "You've reminded me of something I forgot long ago, that music isn't about perfection, it's about heart. You've got more heart than anyone I've ever met." The man smiled, his eyes kind and humble. "We all have music inside us," he said quietly. "Some of us just need the right moment to let it out." In the weeks that followed, his name spread further. Invitations came from music schools, television stations, and even famous concert halls abroad. But he turned most of them down. He didn't want to chase fame. He didn't want to live on stages or travel from one show to another. What he wanted was simple: to keep teaching, to keep playing, and to stay close to the life that had given him his music. The community center became busier than ever. New students joined, inspired by his story. Some came from far away just to meet him, hoping to learn something beyond technique, to learn how to play with feeling. He never charged more than he needed to survive. Music, he would say, is not a business. It's a gift. You share it, not sell it. One afternoon, a young boy came to him after class and said, "Sir, people say you're famous now. Why do you still teach here?" He smiled gently and said, "Because fame doesn't make you happy. Doing what you love does." The boy nodded slowly, thinking deeply about those words. He probably didn't understand them fully yet, but one day he would. As time went by, the man's story continued to inspire many. Newspapers called him the pianist who played from the soul. Music teachers spoke of him in classrooms, telling students to never underestimate the power of feeling. But in his heart, he stayed the same humble man who once snuck into a neighbor's house to play an old broken piano. Sometimes at night, he'd walk back to that same community hall. The lights would be dim and the streets would be quiet. He'd sit at the same piano that had witnessed his journey and play softly to himself. Those who passed by could sometimes hear faint music drifting through the window, slow, tender, almost like a lullaby. He didn't play for the world anymore. He played for peace, for the boy he once was and for the man he became. And though his life had changed, he never forgot that one night, the night people laughed when he sat down. That laughter had been the spark that set everything in motion. It had pushed him to show not his pride but his heart, and because of that he carried no bitterness toward those who had doubted him, only gratitude. Music, he often thought, had taught him more about life than anything else. It had taught him patience when the world ignored him. It had taught him hope when days felt empty. And most of all, it had taught him that true greatness never needs to be loud. Sometimes the quietest moments leave the deepest echoes. Years later, when people still spoke of that night, they didn't talk about fame or skill. They talked about how they felt when he played. That strange, beautiful feeling that reminded them to believe again. That was his legacy. Not fame, not trophies, not money. Just a simple melody that stayed in people's hearts long after the sound had faded. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that was all he ever wanted. The years moved quietly after that night. Seasons came and went, the city changed, faces grew older, and yet his life remained beautifully simple. He still lived in his small home with its squeaky door and warm light spilling from the window each evening. Every morning he made the same tea, walked down the same street, and smiled at the same neighbors who had now grown used to greeting him as the music man. People still recognized him sometimes. They would stop him on the street and say, "Aren't you the man who played that night at the concert?" He would smile politely and nod. They would tell him how much that performance had meant to them, how it made them believe in something again. He always thanked them quietly, but deep inside he still couldn't fully believe how one simple moment had changed everything. Even now he never thought of himself as famous. To him, fame was something loud, glittering, and far away, something that came and went like passing clouds. What he had was quieter, like sunlight through an old window. It stayed, it warmed, it healed. The children at the community center continued to grow and new faces replaced the old ones. They came to him with shy smiles and clumsy fingers, eager to learn. He always started the same way. Not with notes, not with lessons, but with words. "Close your eyes," he would say, "and feel what music means to you." The children would giggle, not fully understanding, but eventually they would. Over time, he taught them that music wasn't about speed or perfection. It was about heart. He never raised his voice, never rushed them, never scolded mistakes. To him, every mistake was just a hidden door to something new. "Let the piano talk," he used to say softly. "If you listen, it will tell you what it wants." And it always did. Sometimes, during his quiet moments alone, he would think about that night long ago. The laughter, the silence, the applause. It wasn't pride that filled him, but gratitude. He didn't play to prove anyone wrong. He played to remember who he was. And somehow, in doing that, he had reminded others who they were too. A few years later, one of his students, a teenage girl with big dreams and nervous hands, got accepted into a prestigious music academy. When she told him, tears filled her eyes. "It's because of you," she said. "You made me believe I could do it." He smiled, though his eyes glistened a little too. "No," he said kindly. "It's because you believed in yourself. I just reminded you." She hugged him before leaving for her new life. He watched her go, standing at the door, feeling both proud and peaceful. She reminded him of himself, young, hopeful, standing before the wide-open world with music in her heart. Days turned into months, months into years. The world changed faster than he could keep up with. New songs, new styles, new stars filled the airwaves. Yet somehow people never forgot his story. The internet kept it alive. Clips of that old concert still floating around, shared by people who had never even been there. They called him the man who played from the soul. He found it strange but touching. He never tried to chase that attention again. He stayed in his little town, still teaching, still playing, still living a life that was simple and true. And maybe that was why people loved him even more. Because in a world full of noise and show, he was still quiet, still real. Sometimes, when the evenings were cool and the sky was painted in soft shades of gold, he would walk to the community hall alone. The building was older now, the paint fading a bit, the wooden doors creaking. Inside, the old piano still stood, its keys yellowed by time, its sound still imperfect. But when he sat down and placed his fingers on it, the world around him disappeared. He didn't need an audience. The piano was enough. It had always been enough. He played not for applause, but for memory. The memory of his father's tired hands, his mother's quiet strength, the long nights when dreams seemed too far away, and the laughter that had once filled a hall before it turned to silence. Each note he played carried all those things, all those pieces of a life that had shaped him. Sometimes, the janitor, an old friend now, would come in quietly and sit on a bench in the corner listening without saying a word. When the song ended, he'd just smile and say, "Still got it." And the man would smile back, saying, "It's not something you lose. It just waits." One winter evening, the professional musician, the same one who had invited him to perform years ago, came to visit. He had grown older too, his hair grayer, his movement slower. They sat together for a long time, talking about life, about music, about how things had changed. "You know," the musician said, "I've played all over the world since that night, but no performance ever felt as real as the one you gave. I think I've been chasing that feeling ever since." The man laughed softly. "That feeling isn't something you find on a stage," he said gently. "It's something you find inside yourself." The musician nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You were right all along," he said. "Music isn't about being the best. It's about being honest." They played together that night. Two old souls side by side at the piano, their music blending like old friends meeting after years apart. It wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, a few laughs, and a few pauses, but it was beautiful because it was real. When they finished, the musician looked at him and said, "You know, that first night, I thought you were just an old man trying to prove a point. But now I see you were never trying to prove anything. You were just sharing something pure." The man smiled softly. "That's all any of us can do," he said. "Share what's real." After that evening, he felt a quiet completeness, like a chapter of his life had gently closed. He continued teaching for a few more years, still filling that little hall with laughter, mistakes, and melodies. His students adored him, not just as a teacher, but as someone who believed in them when no one else did. One day, he decided to record a few of his pieces, not for fame or money, but so that his music could stay even after he was gone. He recorded them on an old piano, with the sounds of creaking wood and breathing silence between notes. It was imperfect but honest, just like his life. He named the collection For Those Who Still Dream. When the recordings were released online, people from all over the world listened. They said it felt like listening to someone's soul. The comments were filled with gratitude, love, and quiet tears. His music had once again found its way into people's hearts, gently, without trying. As years went on, his hands grew weaker. His fingers trembled sometimes, but he still played, even if only for a few minutes a day. The piano had become part of him, his oldest and truest friend. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, he sat by the window, the golden light falling on his face. The air was calm and the world seemed softer somehow. He looked at the piano in the corner, smiled, and whispered, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" That night he played one last song. It was slow and tender, filled with peace. Every note seemed to carry a goodbye. Not a sad one, but a gentle farewell full of gratitude. It was as if he was saying thank you, hon, to life, to music, to every person who had ever believed, doubted, laughed, or listened. When the song ended, he sat still for a long time, his hands resting on the keys, eyes closed, heart full. And in that silence there was no applause, no lights, no crowd, and just peace. The next morning, when the janitor entered the hall, he found him there, still sitting by the piano, his head slightly bowed, a faint smile on his face. The man was gone, quietly, gracefully, just like his music. The news spread quickly. People everywhere mourned, not just a musician, but a soul who had touched their hearts. The community center was filled with flowers, candles, and photographs. His students gathered, each one sharing a story about how he had changed their lives. The professional musician came too, placing a single white rose on the piano. He stood there for a long time, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what real music is." Later, the town decided to keep the old piano just as it was, worn, imperfect, but full of memories. They placed a small plaque above it that read, "He played not for fame, but for truth." And in doing so, he found both. Every year on the anniversary of his final concert, people gathered in that same hall. The lights would dim, and one of his students, now grown, would sit at the piano and play the same melody he once played the night he silenced the laughter. And as the last note faded, the hall would fall silent just like before. That same silence that held more meaning than any applause. Because even though he was gone, his music stayed. It lived in every heart that had ever heard it, in every child who dared to dream, and in every soul that believed it's never too late to begin again. And somewhere, maybe beyond the sound of this world, his music still played, and soft, timeless, and full of light.